Beloved, it is good to be with you. I call you beloved not only because we share a faith, Unitarian Universalism, or because we find ourselves in this moment in a sanctuary, but I also call you beloved as an act of aspiration of what we may be together and how we may move together in our world. Beloved, be loved. I want to thank Reverend John for the invitation to be here, and to each of you in the UU Church of Annapolis. I have to say, it is so good to be here. I didn't encounter one person who didn't take the opportunity to welcome me when I was here for the first service and coming into the second service. It's truly a warm place and a beautiful community. And I want to thank you for the great night of sleep that you gave me. Because I came into town yesterday, which meant I spent the night at a hotel. I have 5 kids, 4 of whom are home, ages 6 through 10. So thank you so much for that rare blessing. My spouse, a recently retired UU minister, Reverend Anne Marie Alderman, she might be feeling a little different right about now, but that's a sermon for another day. It is good to be with you, beloved. Beloved, love at the center. At the center, our new values. How many folks have received the word of our new values as Unitarian Universalists? All right, a few. You might be able to help me then. These values: justice, equity, generosity, transformation, interdependence, and there's one more. Pluralism. That one's a little tricky, isn't it? I know when the values first came out in my community, a lot of my folks were saying, what does pluralism mean? That feels like a $2 seminary word, at least. And what does it mean to lift that up as a value of our faith? What does it mean to live into pluralism? But that's not my topic really today. I came here to discuss something far easier: inoculating ourselves against authoritarianism. That might be a $4 word, that's right. Now, what business does this New Jersey girl by way of North Carolina and upstate New York have to do with preaching to y'all about authoritarianism? I am guessing by my location there are a few of you in this room who could probably write a book explaining authoritarianism, but I don't come to you today as a politician, a professor, or a policy expert, though each of these have a vital role in fighting the now global rise in authoritarianism. That is, the rise of a political system seeking to centralize power, to reduce political plurality, to suppress individual freedom and human rights, to eradicate democracy, and undermine, if not erase, the rule of law. It is likely, I hope, politically and legally self-evident to most in this room why we ought to be fighting the global rise of authoritarianism. According to the Freedom House's work, fewer than 1/5 of the world's population right now lives in a free society. Do you know by the end of 2024, nearly 2 billion voters around the world representing 50 countries will cast their ballot in an election that very well could add to this global rise in authoritarianism or could defeat it? Now, what is causing this rise might also be pretty evident to many people in this room. We have a climate crisis causing massive shifts in global migration, increasing conflicts, battles over resources, globalization, a rise in iniquity, social iniquity, and finally, rapid changes in technology that have led to mass misinformation and election interference. So now that you're good and depressed, I'm going to ask us to move past what might be some despair this day and to entertain the possibility that yes, in this sanctuary, that yes, in Unitarian Universalism, we have a particular role and power to fighting this massive global problem. But I need you to travel with me for a moment, both in time and place. I need us to go back to March 3rd, 1568. Bring a snack, maybe some electrolytes. It was on that day that King John Sigismund invited a public debate in Transylvania on religion. You see, his country was in the midst of a conflict, a religious conflict between Calvinists and Lutherans and Catholics and even a small group of rising Unitarians. All of Europe, frankly, had been besieged by religious conflict, and so the king was eager to figure out what the state religion would be. So he declared a 10-day debate, and at the conclusion of that debate, to everyone's surprise, maybe even his own, Francis David won, the Unitarian. And so the king was all ready to write the seal and declare Unitarianism the state religion and slaughter anyone who wouldn't comply. And that's when David raised his hand and said, "Sir, I think you missed the point of my argument." And out of that moment, the Edict of Torda was written, which was the first act of religious tolerance in all of Europe. Now, it wasn't radical, right? It wasn't tolerance. It certainly wasn't inclusion the way we think of, but it was a beginning to be able to say even these different Christian groups can coexist in a space and time. Over 300 years later, in that same place, communism took over. And our Hungarian Unitarian colleagues were treated terribly harshly under authoritarian rule because, one, they were a minority as Hungarians in a Romanian country, and two, they were a religious minority as Unitarians. Most of our partnerships between Unitarian Universalist congregations in the U.S. and our Unitarian colleagues and partners in Transylvania come only after the fall of communism there in 1989, because we couldn't be in touch before. In fact, for our Unitarian colleagues, just going to church during that time for our friends could put them under surveillance, could put them at harassment. They might lose their job, they might be put in prison, they might even face death. This past summer, I went to visit Transylvania for the second time, and I was eager to get some time with the elders there because I wanted to ask them, what was it like? How did they survive under this authoritarian rule? I had a little vested interest. It's been a little scary here. One of the things that I learned was in that time, virtually everyone was an informant for the government, which meant anyone could turn on you. And so when I asked this group of elders how did they do it, they described something that roughly from Hungarian translates to being two-faced, which sounds very bad. But something's lost in the translation. What it really means is that you developed one face for the public, and you developed another side of yourself where you were more vulnerable, more trusting, leaned into community, real community, the intimacy of community. So I asked these elders, I said, yeah, I think I understand that, but really, how did you survive? You couldn't even gather in the church. How did you keep your faith alive? And one of the elders gave a very long explanation in Hungarian, and then the interpreter looked at me and said, she said that they gathered in their living rooms. And I kind of chuckled like you. I thought, oh, they didn't understand the question. So then I reiterated in English, no, I mean like under surveillance and threat of punishment and all of this persecution. How did you keep your faith? And then I realized the joke was on me because as she translated my question, stated again, the three elders who were gathered kind of chuckled at each other and looked at one another. You know that moment of like, oh, I'm the one who didn't get the answer? Because they were answering my question. They met in the living room because they leaned into community, because they realized that the church wasn't a building, that the faith wasn't a public profession in the way of simple words, that it was a way you lived your life. And in one of the most perilous times when they should have trusted absolutely no one, they leaned more toward each other. It was in that moment as I looked at the eyes of these elders and I realized I had experienced that kind of community before. I did know what it meant to be able to lean into people. It was at the border between California and Mexico. It's in 2017. Maybe some of you remember that moment and what was happening at our southern border. Maybe you remember the stories of children being imprisoned and families being separated, some of whom have never been reunited to this day. I went there with hundreds of other faith leaders, and I was asked to help be part of an organizing coalition to bring attention to what was happening at the southern border and to make a witness, a faithful witness. We got there a week in advance. We planned extensively, and we had been planning for months over calls and Zoom and signal chats, and we went through all of the contingencies because in part the border there, if you've ever been there, is not very accessible. You have to walk down a very long beach, and it's only when you come to the very end of that beach that you can see this wall that extends out into the ocean. I have to tell you what, it does something to the heart to see a wall in the ocean. It's made by these tiny little slats, one after the other. So we went through all these contingencies and training, and what if this happens and what if that happens, knowing that also we'd have to bring in all of our own media to ensure that this was documented. We got to the morning of, and all of the faith leaders were gathering, and all of a sudden, we weren't sure if she was going to be with us, the Methodist bishop walked into the room. Now, we don't have bishops. So I have a little bishop envy, okay? It's like a little something, you know. And she came in and she had all her robes on and the, bishop's cross, and you could just feel it like, oh, the bishop is here, you know. But she also carried her authority within her. It actually wasn't about the robes or the particular size of the cross that she was wearing. It just was kind of an aura. And I kind of had to pull myself together because my job was to tell the bishop where to go. I know. So I got all of the clergy, faith leaders lined up, and we started marching down this beach, which took us a long time. And as we got closer, we could see that the border police were already lined up. And we'd prepared for this. We were trying to make it to the wall. But what we weren't prepared for is how aggressive they were going to be. They had their batons out already. And as soon as we got to the line, they started pulling people out of our line and putting them behind theirs where we could no longer see them. And the first few folks who were pulled were all of our organizers, anyone with a camera. Our media was gone. And then they took an elderly blind faith leader who was in our contingent, and they pulled her and threw her to the sand. And there was a kind of chaos that erupted in that moment. And people lost their positions in the line, and the line got longer. It extended out into the ocean. And that's when I looked and I saw that bishop in all of her bishopry standing in the ocean where, because of that wall, trash was just flowing around her. And I could feel that moment where you fear the worst, right? You're afraid someone is going to get hurt. And it was just at that moment, as I was trying to look to see who was left, all the organizers had been arrested, and I couldn't see where they were, that I saw the front line of all the planning, the careful planning that we had done. I saw them right up against the batons of the officers. I saw them drop to their knees. We had planned for so many contingencies. Nowhere in the plan did people drop to their knees. And my first response was, oh my, get up, you're going to get a baton in the face. And I felt this breeze come through, but more than a breeze, there was a quiet that fell. And so I didn't say a word. And in that holy quiet, without any communication to each other, that front line started to crawl. And the officers were as stunned as I was. And they put their batons at their side, and they started to make spaces between them and to back up. And we crawled our way to that wall. What we didn't know until we got to that wall is the whole time there had been children waiting on the other side. And when we saw their faces, without any words needed, we understood. It was like an eruption of gratitude. It was a kind of love embodied that I had not planned at all for. Without words, without a strategic plan, without any of our contingencies, without even a shared faith amongst us, we moved that wall. In 1984, Audre Lorde, the self-described Black lesbian poet, faced a decision. She had just found out that her cancer had returned. She had first had breast cancer, and now it was in her liver. And her doctors at that point were recommending immediate aggressive treatment. But she had been invited to teach in West Berlin, something she had always wanted to do, and so she faced this decision. Should she go, or should she stay and start treatment? She decided to go. She declined the aggressive treatment at that time, and she determined with whatever time she had left, she would write, teach, leave a legacy. Lorde's time in West Berlin would extend until her death in 1992. She would come back and forth between the U.S. and West Berlin again and again. It became a kind of a second home, in truth, for her and her partner, Gloria Joseph. On that first trip, though, Lorde really anticipated she was mostly going to be speaking to white German women. And so she was surprised when she began her lectures and began to encounter so many African German women. Lorde's work is credited with shaping the Afro-German identity movement, which continues in strength to this day there. Facing her death, she would create some of the most important works we have in womanism today. And ahead of our present situation, she saw, in a way, what was coming. She wrote in her journal after her first trip to West Berlin, how can we use each other's differences in our common battles for a livable future? Our differences brought into a common battle for a livable future. Not just difference to sit and passively admire. Isn't it great? We're all different and just doing nothing about it. Her solution to such forces as the ones we are facing now was not uniformity or denial of difference or the mere admiration of difference. Instead, Audre Lorde pleaded with us to utilize those differences as strategy, as strength, as a pathway for a livable future. Communities she envisioned focusing on what mattered, flourishing with different perspectives and experiences, drawing better paths forward because of that diversity. So what inoculates us against authoritarianism? Real community with trust and diversity, with joy and honest struggle, a faith that cherishes true pluralism by inhabiting it. Pluralism. We are all sacred beings, diverse in culture, experience, and theology. Pluralism, that one little value that we almost cut out of the figure entirely at one point because we thought it just might not fit. Pluralism, it turns out, might be one of the most important values that we passed at this General Assembly. Real community in difference. Yes, racial difference. Yes, cultural difference, but also generational difference and theological and spiritual difference. Authoritarianism cannot thrive or take a foothold in places that choose to be beloved to each other, in places that choose to declare that we are all sacred beings. In true community where there is joy, a love that holds one another as sacred, true communities that cherish pluralism, we see this kind of remarkable joy and love that I saw in the faces of those children when we crawled our way past that wall. It is a community that inhabits joy, the kind of festival that theologian Elaine Padilla says manifests God. And I disagree with Patrick Healy, the New York Times opinion editor, when he says joy is not a strategy. Maybe not for a particular political campaign. I'll leave that to the experts. But joy is a strategy in transformation. Ever been to a Pride festival? Can't tell me joy is not a strategy for transformation. If you're facing authoritarian rule seeking to control your ability to think, your bodily autonomy, your ability to learn and question your vote, your gender, your ability to move and to reside where you choose, then watch what such powers do in the face of joy. A newly out teenager dancing with a feather boa around their neck. A first-generation college student taking hold of that diploma, a couple of any difference being in a relationship and loving loudly, or the joy of being safe and you and living into that story because thank God you had the choice to do it. Joy is dangerous to dictators. It is unpredictable, it is uncontrollable, it subverts and defies. Joy is resistance. And it is the gift of communities that midwife liberation. So that's it, beloved. We can call one another that now, right? I just came by here today to put in a good word, a note of faith in this thing called pluralism, a note of hope in this defeating sense of despair, a note of recommendation for this little catalyst called community, with a dash of joy, a heap of trust, and at least 2 cups of diversity. I just want you to remember, we're talking real community, though, where you can show up as you are, maybe not ready to be in public, tears on your face, no sleep under the eyes, torn up, beat up, sobering up, praying, terrified. Community where you can slide into the back row. I see you, back row. Even Reverend John's in the back row. What's going on over there? Or where you can be online or gather in a living room because you are the church. And you don't have to say a fake, hey, y'all, because you just missed your electric bill, or you got into another fight with your spouse, or you snapped at your kid on the way into church. Community where you don't even need the church building because the values are in our heart and our actions, and we don't expect perfection of one another, but we lean into a real trust and authenticity. Community where you know, you might not know how, but you can trust when that wind blows, you can fall to your knees and you can crawl together to freedom. Community here with one last chance. Someone here in community is here this day because you're giving it one last chance. And someone else here is going to have enough heart and soul to stay with that person, to see that person, to call them beloved. That kind of community, beloved, co-conspirators for justice, creators of beloved community, called by something. Maybe it is just the dream of a livable future. Maybe it's the sweetness of differences brought into strength. Maybe it's just the sweet relief of the other side of fear. But whatever calls you, you create this community in the minutia of this minute. It is not some glorious moment led by a Moses. It is the ordinary people who keep gathering in the living room. It is not some fairy tale timeline. It is right here and right now, and the only ones saving us are us. You create it in the mundane and the courageous that brought you each here this day. You create it in when you take hands, when you wear those values on the outside, when the chalice is lit at work, at home, in the streets, in the classrooms, and in the voting booth. That is why we save each other. Because we know a livable future is possible. That future still can be. If only. If only. If only we will be loved. Beloved. 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 And let the people say,